What does it feel like to stand behind a 5-inch gun for 80 straight minutes while 22 enemy aircraft take turns trying to kill you, one after another, with nothing between you and them but a steel deck and the men beside you? What do you do when 6 of those aircraft actually hit your ship, when bombs tear through your gun mounts, when a third of your crew is dead or wounded, and your captain looks at what's left of his ship and rates her 30% combat effective, and you keep fighting anyway? U.S. Navy veterans who served aboard destroyers in the Pacific still talk about April 16, 1945, the way men talk about the day that never fully leaves them. On that morning off the coast of Okinawa, a destroyer called the USS Laffey absorbed more punishment than almost any American warship in the entire war and stayed afloat. We'll show you exactly what those 80 minutes looked like in a moment. First, you need to understand why this one small ship ended up standing alone against an entire wave of the Japanese Air Force. This is the story of the USS Laffey. U.S. Navy veterans still call her the ship that would not die. The threat by April of 1945, the Battle of Okinawa had become the largest and last major campaign of the entire Pacific War, and Japanese commanders, facing the loss of the last major island standing between American forces and the home islands themselves, turned to a tactic they believed could still change the outcome: coordinated kamikaze assaults. Waves of aircraft deliberately crashed into American ships, aimed specifically at the radar picket destroyers stationed in a ring around the main invasion fleet, ships whose job was to provide early warning of incoming air attacks, and that, by the very nature of that assignment, sat directly in the path of everything Japan could still throw at the American Navy. The USS Laffey, an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer commissioned barely a year earlier, was no stranger to combat by the time she took up station at Radar Picket Station No. 1, roughly 30 miles north of Okinawa, in mid-April 1945. She had already fought offshore batteries at Normandy on D-Day, survived kamikaze attacks at Ormoc Bay in the Philippines, and supported the landings at Lingayen Gulf. Her crew of 336 officers and men were by that point in the war established combat veterans in every meaningful sense, men who understood exactly what radar picket duty meant, because other ships on that same rotation had already lost crew members and taken serious damage from kamikaze attacks in the weeks before Laffey's turn came. The radar picket assignment itself represented one of the most dangerous and least celebrated duties in the entire Pacific Fleet by the spring of 1945. Ships stationed on the picket line existed specifically to absorb the first wave of any incoming Japanese air attack, providing the main invasion fleet further south with the early warning it needed to prepare its own defenses, a mission that meant the picket ships themselves received comparatively little of the layered air cover protecting the larger fleet they were screening. Laffey's crew understood this reality clearly by the time they arrived on station. A specialized fighter direction team had been embarked aboard the ship specifically to help coordinate whatever air cover could be summoned once an attack began. Recognition at the planning level that picket duty demanded exactly this kind of specialized preparation given how exposed these ships inevitably were. The secret development: there was no secret weapon aboard the USS Laffey that morning. What there was instead was a well-drilled crew, a specialized fighter direction team embarked to help coordinate air cover, and a ship that had already proven across multiple earlier engagements that it could take a hit and keep fighting. At 8:30 on the morning of April 16th, the attack began with a single Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, quickly driven off by Laffey's gunners. It was only the opening note. Shortly afterward, 4 more aircraft arrived, diving directly at the destroyer. 3 were shot down by Laffey's deck guns before they could reach the ship at all. The 4th, approaching from the stern, clipped the water with its landing gear and was damaged but continued its run. Laffey's crew shot down 2 more approaching dive bombers, then 2 more, one of which grazed the ship before crashing into the sea, and another that struck Laffey directly, killing 3 crewmen and destroying several deck guns in the impact. And that was still only the beginning of what would become an 80-minute ordeal. Overhead, American fighter support arrived to help turn the tide. 4 Grumman Wildcats from the escort carrier USS Shamrock Bay and 12 Marine Corsairs launched from Yanton Airfield on Okinawa itself, engaging the Japanese formation in the airspace immediately around the embattled destroyer, and shooting down between 15 and 17 additional enemy aircraft in the vicinity of the ship. But Laffey's own crew, manning guns that had already taken direct hits and working amid fires and wreckage on their own deck, continued fighting throughout, because the aircraft that got past the fighter cover still had to be stopped by someone, and there was no one else positioned to do it. The sheer duration of the assault set it apart from most kamikaze attacks American ships had previously endured. Many earlier attacks throughout the Pacific campaign involved a single aircraft or a small handful pressing home an attack over the course of a few minutes. What Laffey faced on the morning of April 16th was closer to a continuous rolling assault sustained across roughly 80 minutes. Wave after wave of aircraft arriving with little pause between attacks, meaning her gun crews had almost no opportunity to catch their breath, clear jammed weapons, or fully assess damage before the next threat was already inbound. That sustained tempo, rather than any single moment of maximum danger, is what U.S. Navy veterans who study the engagement point to as the defining characteristic of what Laffey's crew actually endured. Not one terrifying moment, but an unbroken hour and 20 minutes of continuous combat. Technical supremacy. There is no chapter in this story about a single decisive weapon, because what kept the USS Laffey afloat that morning was the accumulated effect of hundreds of individual actions. Gun crews reloading and firing through smoke and wreckage, damage control parties fighting fires in compartments that had just taken direct hits, and a ship's company that simply refused to stop functioning as a fighting unit no matter how much damage accumulated around them. Over the course of roughly 80 minutes, Laffey was struck by at least 6 kamikaze aircraft and 4 bombs, an intensity and duration of sustained attack that few American warships of the entire war were asked to absorb and survive. A bomb struck near one of the ship's gun mounts, destroying it and killing 6 men instantly. Another kamikaze strike tore through the ship's structure, starting fires that damage control parties fought even as additional aircraft continued their attack runs overhead. Commander F. Julian Beckton, Laffey's commanding officer, moved through the ship assessing the damage as it accumulated, and at the point where he judged the vessel to be operating at roughly 30% combat effectiveness, having already absorbed what would have sunk many comparable warships several times over, he made the determination that Laffey would continue fighting rather than withdraw. That decision, made in the middle of an ongoing attack with the ship still burning and still under fire, reflected exactly the kind of composed, continued judgment under sustained pressure that separates a crew that survives an ordeal like this from one that does not. By the time the attack finally ended, Laffey's own gun crews were credited with shooting down 8 enemy aircraft outright, a tally achieved by men firing from a ship that had already been struck repeatedly, working weapons that in several cases had already lost crew members to earlier hits, continuing to load and fire because the alternative, letting the next aircraft through unopposed, was simply not a choice anyone aboard was willing to make. The damage control effort running simultaneously alongside the ongoing gunnery deserves its own recognition, because keeping Laffey's guns firing was only half of what her crew accomplished that morning. Fires ignited by the bomb and kamikaze strikes threatened at various points to reach ammunition stores and fuel systems that could have destroyed the ship far more completely than any single impact had managed on its own. Damage control parties worked through smoke and wreckage in compartments that had in some cases just been struck directly to isolate and extinguish those fires before they could spread to more critical systems. That work, largely invisible in the dramatic accounts of aircraft shot down and bombs absorbed, was every bit as essential to the ship's survival as the anti-aircraft fire itself. A second, parallel battle fought below decks, while the visible fight against incoming aircraft continued above. The global impact when the assault finally ended. The USS Laffey had suffered 32 men killed and 71 wounded out of a crew of 336, losses that touched nearly a third of everyone aboard. And yet the ship herself remained afloat, battered, burning in places, but under her own power and still capable of fighting. She would be towed and later steamed to Seattle for extensive repairs, eventually returning to active service before the war's end arrived just months later. The Navy's own post-war assessment of the engagement recognized exactly what Laffey's crew had accomplished. The ship and her crew received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest collective honors the Navy can bestow, for what the citation described as heroism in action, fighting her guns valiantly against waves of hostile suicide planes plunging toward her from all directions. Individual crew members were awarded 2 Navy Crosses, 6 Silver Stars, and 18 Bronze Stars, a concentration of individual valor recognition that reflects just how many separate acts of courage were required, compressed into those 80 minutes, to keep the ship fighting and afloat. Naval historians who have studied the Battle of Okinawa have consistently identified the attack on Laffey as among the fiercest sustained assaults any single American warship endured and survived throughout the entire Second World War. Laffey's survival carried significance that extended beyond her own crew's fate. The radar picket line as a whole absorbed a disproportionate share of the kamikaze campaign's fury throughout the Okinawa battle, and every ship that survived its own turn on station, however battered, reinforced the broader picket screen's ability to continue providing the early warning the main invasion fleet depended on. A total of 368 American ships suffered damage during the 82-day Okinawa campaign, and another 34 were sunk outright, figures that place Laffey's survival in its proper context. She was one of the fortunate ships that endured a devastating attack and lived to be repaired and returned to service, a distinction not every vessel on picket duty that spring was able to share. Conclusion: U.S. Navy veterans who served aboard Laffey, and the destroyer sailors who served alongside her in the radar picket line at Okinawa more broadly, have spent the 8 decades since April 16, 1945, returning to that morning in memory in reunions and in the ceremonies that veterans organizations still hold at the ship herself, preserved today as a museum vessel at Patriots Point in South Carolina. Every April, surviving veterans and their families gather to remember the 32 men who did not come home from those 80 minutes, walking through the same passageways and past the same gun mounts where the fighting actually happened, a direct physical connection to that morning that few other memorials to the Pacific War can offer in quite the same way. The nickname the ship earned that day, the ship that would not die, was not a phrase invented later by historians looking for a dramatic headline. It grew directly out of what her own crew and the wider Navy witnessed in the immediate aftermath. A destroyer that should have been sunk several times over by any reasonable measure of what 6 kamikaze strikes and 4 bomb hits typically do to a ship her size, that instead stayed afloat because the men aboard her refused to let her go down. That is the story U.S. Navy veterans carry forward from that morning, not simply a record of damage absorbed and casualties suffered, but a plain, specific memory of exactly what it took, gun crew by gun crew, compartment by compartment, to keep a badly wounded ship in the fight until the attack finally, mercifully, came to an end. Frank Manson, a young officer serving as Laffey's communications officer during the attack, would go on to a distinguished naval career spanning more than 2 decades, eventually retiring as a captain in 1969, but he continued speaking about that April morning for the rest of his life, one of many Laffey veterans who understood that their own individual memories represented something the official reports and citations, however accurate, could never fully capture on their own. That pattern, veterans returning again and again across decades to describe not just what happened but what it felt like, what specific moments stayed with them, which shipmates' face they still remember from those 80 minutes, is precisely why the ship's preservation as a museum vessel matters as much as it does. It gives each new generation of visitors, veterans and civilians alike, a physical place to stand while listening to exactly what happened there, the same steel deck, the same damaged gun mounts, transformed from a battle report into something you can actually walk through and touch.